How did you come about representing people from Hamas and Hezbollah and a relative of Osama bin Laden?
Well, I years ago as a legal aid attorney, I was involved with my local legal aid office in organizing demonstrations and boycotts around apartheid in South Africa. And moving our union to take a stand on that. And eventually I merged off and took a closer look in terms of Palestine. So for years before I represented Palestinians in particular and Muslims in general in terms of the Middle East, I had been active in trying to air what was going on in Palestine, how Palestinians were being subjected to genocide then, how Palestinians were being targeted, what was going on domestically in the United States. And how I got directly involved was I represented a large number of young Albanian men and women, Muslim community. And I was involved in negotiations with the State Department many years ago, which permitted young Albanian men largely to go to Bosnia. And these were largely undocumented men or people that there were arrest warrants. And they joined, this is before Clinton in the Sarajevo situation. They joined the KLA, and there was a deal worked out that they could go and fight. And it was a secret army of the United States in the West, and if they wanted to come back, they could come back. So that sort of branched me off into a different area in the Muslim world. And I became involved with some fairly, this is even before CARE developed, and I knew the founders of CARE. I became involved with some groups in Washington that were Muslim advocacy groups in the early days in the early 1990s. And I had just finished a 6-month trial, a pro bono trial, representing squatters in the Lower East Side of Manhattan on the 13th Street battle. And I was exhausted, and I was going with my then girlfriend to the beach in Maine. And I got a call one day from the leader of this Muslim group, this organization, civil rights group, said, "Listen, there's someone who's been detained at the airport. We'd like you to go and see if may perhaps represent them." And I said, I'm too tired. I'm exhausted. I can't do it. My girlfriend's going to kill me. I said, well, who is it? And I'm listening. And I had, jeans on and a sweatshirt, and my hair was all over the place. And he said, it's Musa Abu Marzouk. And I said, who's that? And I just can't do it. I'm going to get killed, and I'm exhausted, and I'm tired. I'm wearing my work boots, my ripped jeans, my sweat. He said, um, he's the head of the political wing of Hamas. And I went, oh, okay. He said, okay. So I called my girlfriend and I said, listen, something's come up. And go to Maine. And this was a young legal aid attorney at the time who had been a clerk for a federal judge. And she said, well, what's going on? We were going away. So I told her, she said, okay, get up here when you can. So I went to MCC and I showed up with my ripped shirt and jeans and hair all over the place and sweatshirt. I think I might have even had the sweatshirt I wore at Oka when I was indicted by the Canadian government for seditious conspiracy, and I wasn't a Canadian citizen. That said, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. It was a Shakespeare quote. So I walked in to see Abu Marzouk, and he looked at me and he said hi, and I had a little code that I'd been given so that he would know I was the real deal. So I said it, and he looked at me and he said, who are you? As he looked up and down at me, looking anything like a lawyer. And I said, I'm a lawyer. And he said, I don't need a lawyer. I said, you're right. You need a dozen lawyers. Um, and that began a journey with Abu Marzouk where we met 4 nights a week for 2 years, every night, 4 nights a week
Wow.
for hours. I suspect we spent 1,000 hours sitting and talking. And I got to tell you, a lot of it had nothing to do with the case. It was about politics and the world and Palestine and life and movements and resistance and armed struggle and what the movement was about and what Palestine was about. And as part of my defense, I went then to Gaza and I met his godfather of sorts, who had introduced him to his wife, who was and remains very close with me 30 years later, and that was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And so from there, it spun off, and I won the case with Abu Marzouk. Israel tried to extradite him, and we ended up working out an agreement that the detainer was lifted. He gave up his green card in the United States, and he went to Jordan. And the funny story is he was on a plane going, and they still had handcuffs being returned to Jordan. And the FBI agent who told me years later, I ran into him on another terrorism case, said to him, "You're lucky, we're worried about you. You're lucky." And Abu Marzouk apparently said to the agent, "I'd worry more about Cohen than I would me." So from there, look, when you represent the head of one of the original founders and the head of its political wing, I branched off, and from there, it's now been 30 years. And then Hezbollah reached out, and I did work with them, and Al-Manar I represented on some matters. And then along the way, I became involved with some alleged Al-Qaeda men that had been illegally detained in Guantanamo. So some of the same men that I worked with in the negotiations to try to save Peter Kassig from execution when I was negotiating with ISIS in 2014 to save his life. And Obama decided to have him killed and played a role in it and just pulled the plug on what we were doing. So, it just sort of branched off over the years. And I represented someone alleged with, being a leader of a terrorist sect in Romania, and became an expert witness in an attack on Radio 789 in South Africa, which was a Muslim station, being sued by Sajbad, the South African Jewish Board of Directors. And then 9/11 kicked in, and the Muslim community in the United States was under siege. People were running scared by the tens of thousands. Communities were disappearing. People were being swept up. Young Muslims in general were frightened, and spent a lot of time working on a lot of those cases, and became involved with the Holy Land 5 case. And, it's just over the years, it's been 30 years of these types of cases. And then in
Let's go
terms of
back to
Bin
yeah.
Laden's son-in-law, I was reached out to by some of the men that had been held illegally or without any basis. In fact, they were from Kuwait. They knew him when he was an imam in Kuwait, and they reached out to see if I would be interested in taking his case, and I did, and spent over a year preparing that case, including doing an examination and the cross-examination in an M15, is it M16, whatever, safe house outside of London, with the testimony of 2 days sent back live streamed back into a federal court in the Southern District of New York, because they wouldn't allow him to be produced as a witness in the United States. So there's lots of these cases, but even before I was doing those cases, I did IRA cases and did Shining Path cases and some Tupa model. It had been a very long time. Did American Indian Movement cases and represented the Warrior Society from the Iroquois Confederacy. Still do for 30 years more.
So a lot of these people are they're labeled terrorists by one government or the other, or many governments. What would you
Mm-hmm.
say about that label in general? About what is a terrorist to you? I mean, you're representing these people, you're getting to know them. You said with Marzouk, you had 1,000 hours of conversation with him. I would imagine 4 nights a week for 2 years. You got to know him quite well, and I'm sure he got to know you quite well. What
Yeah.
did you take away from what do you think of that label in general? And should that label exist? Who should be classified as a terrorist?
The difference between terrorist and freedom fighter is who wins. That's the history of it. The United States has been filled with terrorists from day one. We committed genocide against millions of North American Indians, and they were labeled as freedom fighters, and people defending themselves were the terrorists. Historically in the West, the difference between terrorist and freedom fighter is who wins. Now, there are clear examples of terrorism. Nowhere is it more palpable. Nowhere is it more obvious. Nowhere is it more, generational than in Israel, which has violated for 100 years now, whether it was originally the Irgun, the Stern Gang, whether it was the Haganah, whether it was Palmach, or now it's their great grandchildren or grandchildren today. The label of terrorism is this like anecdotal tap dance. There's international law. There's the Convention Against Genocide. There's war crimes. There's crimes against humanity. There's ethnic cleansing. That doesn't live or die with the label of terrorism. But the biggest terrorists in the world are those that run from international law because they know they are violating it willingly. I find the paradox of the Nuremberg tribunals, which were established to hold Germany and the Nazis accountable for the mass slaughter of Jews and Christians and Muslims and gay women and men. And it evolved. And all these years later, Israel says it doesn't apply to us. So I don't get involved with terrorism, good guy, bad guy, because the Irgun, which kidnapped British soldiers, which hung them, which blew up buildings, which bombed hotels, which engaged in a letter campaign, which engaged in the onset of genocide with the Nakba and has never stopped. They're not considered terrorists today. Zionists laud them as freedom fighters, as those that resisted them as terrorists. So let's get beyond the label of terrorist. There's a body of international law which has evolved, beginning, interestingly enough, with the American Civil War, when the International Red Cross pushed for a whole generation of rules and laws because of the horror that was being perpetrated by the North and Southern armies against civilian populations. And that's where it evolved. So I don't look for the label terrorist. Are there people that I look at and say, look, if you want to find terrorism, take a look at Gaza right now. But it's not just now. People talk about October 7th. Well, there have been 78 years of October 7th in Palestine. Labels sort of, massage people, seduce people. Abu Marzouk, and I've known most of the founders of Hamas. I've known all of the heads of the political wing. I've known Ismail Haniyeh for 25 years. I've known Khalid Mashal for 25 years and Abu Marzouk for 30 years. I know many of the senior, a number of people that were the framers of the original document. I knew Ahmed Yassin very well, Abu Shinab. Many of the women that are involved in the PFLP, many of the men involved with jihad. These are principled freedom fighters. You don't have a choice when it comes to that type of occupation. You don't have a choice when it comes to genocide. You either fight or you die. The notion that somehow resistance becomes criminal, the West is built upon occupation. Every country in NATO, every large country in NATO is built on occupation, is built on genocide, is built on slaughter, is built on subsidy of it. So this, when you ask me the experiences I've had, especially with Palestinians, whether it's with Hamas, whether it's, so-called lone wolves, whether it's jihad, whether it's PFLP, women and men of all different gender, these are dedicated, these are principled people that are fighting to protect their families, their country, their history, to gain liberty, to gain justice, while the world has sat in silence for generations. And they're not alone. I represented Mohawk Indians, and I still do, for Makwasasni, for 35 years. The same thing. I've represented North American Indians in Canada on the West Coast. Genocide there too. The Lebanese that were slaughtered by Israeli phosphorus bombs and cluster bombs in a country that was occupied and invaded routinely, that had torture cells on the border where Israelis tortured women and men. I mean, do you want to call the IRA terrorists? Well, the IRA dates back to before Connolly. Are they okay because they're white and Catholic? That's cool. That's not a problem. But when it comes to people of color, Africa has been colonized for hundreds of years. Slavery came out of there. The French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese have colonized Africa and the Middle East for generations. We wave about Lawrence of Arabia. Well, Lawrence of Arabia created surrogates in in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, etc. So it's a long answer to your question, but to get back to it, I don't get. I've met some. Do I consider ISIS terrorists? Yes. Do I consider the IDF terrorists? Yes. Those are clear examples of people that are targeting civilians, that ignore international law, that rape and pillage and plunder and destroy, and try to erase history and culture. That's terrorism. People that defend their community, their homes, their history, their culture are freedom fighters. Now, are there people that engage in violations of international law in the name of freedom fighting? Yes. But there's a process to review them. And that process isn't slaughtering 100,000 Palestinian civilians, 70% of whom are children and toddlers and women and the elderly. There's international laws. And if we're to have any semblance of justice worldwide, you either have laws, they apply across the board, or they don't. So getting back to the history, particularly of the West, the difference between freedom fighter and terrorist, for them, is who wins.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson show. That's right, this is just a clip. If you want the full show, you can go to KimIversonShow.com and you can watch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for about 1 hour. It's totally free. Check it out, KimIversonShow.com. Thanks for watching.